In this video, we're going to do a brief overview of European colonization of Africa and just kind of set the stage for the document work and the discussions that we're going to have in class over the next couple days. So let's talk about African colonization. In 1875, 10% of Africa was colonized, only 10%. 10 years later, or even, it says 1900, but really only 10 years later, 90% of the continent is colonized by Europe. So this is a very quick, a very rapid, a very tense scramble for Africa, as we call it. So the scramble for African territory begins in 1879 when Henry Stanley, the same explorer who found Dr. David Livingstone, claims Congo for King Leopold II of Belgium, and this kicks off the whole scramble. By the way, Congo, 80 times the size of Belgium. So keep that in mind. I want you to brainstorm between now and class. Why do you think Belgium, a tiny country that we barely ever talk about so far in this course, is able to take a colony and control a colony that's 80 times the size of the mother country? So let's talk about Belgian-Congo for a second. Belgian-Congo was actually Leopold's personal colony. So it wasn't actually controlled by Belgium as a country, but rather it was his personal colony for which he was, well, I'll let you be the judge. At first he says he would use it for research. Remember, this is a time period of lots of new medical advances, Joseph Lister, Louis Pasteur, so Leopold says he wants to use this as a research colony, as a place to research diseases and possible treatments and medicines for those diseases. What actually happens is he uses this to make money, to make a personal profit. There's a lot of resources like rubber, for example, and diamonds and gold. So with that, they treat the people of Africa who are forced into the labor very rough, and they are tortured and they are intimidated. You'll read in a document, for example, that a man's family gets kidnapped and they won't release the family until he produces enough rubber for the Belgian officers. So this is not what Leopold said he would originally do with that colony. The problem here, though, is that if you're another European country and you see how much money is being made in Belgian Congo, you can't resist trying to grab your own colony, because remember that Europe is highly competitive at this time. Each country's jockeying for position and try to be the most powerful country in the continent, and any money that they could make and any power they could get from these colonies would certainly help that competition. So other Europeans see what's going on in the Belgian Congo and they want in, and this leads to the scramble for Africa, or as Leopold calls it, the delicious cake of Africa. So the scramble for Africa causes a lot of tension between countries. It's like they're rushing for a limited resource, and you don't want to be the country that gets stuck with no colony in Africa. Now, as you can imagine, everybody making a mad dash for colonies creates tension, and a lot of people thought that this might actually be the beginning of what would become World War I. But at the last moment, they're able to sit down in Berlin in Germany in 1885 and try to work out a solution where everybody comes away with something on the continent. And that meeting is called the Berlin Conference of 1885. And at this conference, the European countries sat down and they literally sat over a map and carved up the continent amongst all the European powers. Now check out these maps right here. This insert map below, okay? 10% of Africa colonized. All this gray area was not colonized by Europe in just 1878. Just some, some colonies along port areas and along the coast that had existed for a long time before this, but other than that, the continent was wide open. Then we look at 1885, right? 1885, less than 10 years later, 90% of the continent is colonized. With only two exceptions, the colonies are all claimed by Europe. One exception is over here in West Africa. Liberia is created as an independent nation after the U.S. Civil War for slaves to relocate back to their heritage. And over here in the Horn of Africa is Ethiopia, and we'll talk about them in a minute, but they're able to resist colonization. Everybody else is colonized. By the way, no Africans at this meeting. These African people did not have a say over whether or not their nations would be colonized and how that would go down. So there are a couple different ways to rule these colonies. One is direct rule, where Europeans live in the colony and hold all the power. Africans have no power in this model. And then there's indirect rule, where local people are allowed to rule in the colony and answer to the mother country. Don't be fooled. This doesn't mean that local people had a lot of rights. It just meant that they were given a little bit of power, even if it wasn't real power. At the end of the day, the mother country still called all the important shots in the colony. And then there's also the issue of assimilation. In Algeria, for example, the French tried to assimilate Algerians into French culture, and they are met with resistance. And then there's paternalism, which is when you treat the people of the colonies like they're kids who don't know any better, and the mother country is a parent who provides for them, barely, but denies them rights because they just don't know what they're doing. So very quickly, let's go around the continent. In North Africa, France claims Morocco and Algeria, tries to assimilate them into French culture, make them speak French, make them Catholic or Protestant even, but mostly Catholic. But the people of Algeria and Morocco, they resist this, and it brings quite a bit of violence through resistance. Egypt, also another colony in North Africa, important one, is a protectorate of Great Britain, meaning that there was indirect rule by the British. That will change, as we'll talk about it in more detail when we get to the Middle East. More colonies, all of sub-Saharan Africa, so anything south of the Sahara Desert is colonized. Local leaders cut deals for some power, but again, it wasn't really a big deal. Not a lot of decisions being made by them that are important. People are abused, they are denied their rights, and we'll see many examples of that in the primary source documents in class. All the while, Europeans are making a lot of money off their African colonies because there are new markets for them to sell their manufactured goods, but also because of the raw materials that they're able to take from the continent. Ethiopia is the one example, and we'll talk about this more in class, but King Menelik II is able to resist Italian occupation for two reasons. One, he knows the geography very well, and he lures the Italian army into the mountains and then attacks them guerrilla style. And when he does that, he uses modern weapons that he is able to buy from France and Russia. So by doing so, he's able to resist Italian occupation, at least for the time being. South Africa is an interesting situation because before the Conference of Berlin, it was already settled by Dutch Boers who were farmers, and they had been there for quite some time. They clashed with the Zulu, the local people of South Africa, but this gets an interesting spin when Great Britain is given South Africa at the Berlin Conference. And especially, this becomes especially tense when it is discovered that there are a lot of diamonds and lots of diamond mines and diamond fields in South Africa. And this leads to the Boer War, which is a war between the British and the Boers with the Zulu caught up in the middle. And the British end up winning this war and keeping this territory. They cut some deals with the Boers over sharing land, but the diamonds really mostly become property of the British. And Cecil Rhodes is a capitalist from Great Britain, and he benefits greatly from the diamond mines in South Africa. He loves imperialism because he makes a ton of money off of it. And he controlled 90% of the Kimberley diamond mines, which contained most of the diamonds in the world. So obviously, if something makes you very wealthy, you're going to be very much in support of it. And Cecil Rhodes was a strong supporter of imperialism and believed that the British should control an empire in Africa that goes from Cape Town, South Africa, all the way to Cairo, Egypt, as you can see in this political cartoon, with Cecil Rhodes' feet on each of those cities. So here are the essential questions we need to consider when we study Africa this week. Well, how was imperialism different in the various African colonies? You'll see that the methods of control and the reasons for taking the colonies are quite different from region to region. How did imperialism impact the people of the colonies? You'll see a lot of similarities and a few differences, and most of the impact will be negative, as we see, but let's see if we can find some evidence to support that. And then lastly, what, if any, obligations did the Europeans have to the people of Africa? Something that you may notice as we go along is they're not necessarily providing infrastructure, they're not providing an education. So what is the benefit, if any, for the people of Africa? Or at least, what is the benefit from the perspective of the Europeans?